I'm Andres Tallos. I'm now the CEO and founder of Fun Fungus, which is a different studio to the one I'm going to talk about here. Um, so we did create our own internal analytic solutions for reasons I'll explain in a second. It's not necessarily something I would recommend everybody doing, and I'm not going to go into the details of how exactly we went about it. I'll just quickly pass over it. If anybody has questions, please feel free to jump in at any moment. Or even, I do think there's some people who actually make a living out of making analytic solutions. So if you want to chip in also just to add to what I say, please feel free, because I'm not the greatest expert on this. I plan to quickly explain why we actually went into such an adventure and what we learned from it, and maybe some recommendations, if that helps. First of all, to give just a bit of context on who I am and where I come from, I started working as a management consultant, nothing to do with gaming, but I did my fair share of data crunching. And then I was living in Tokyo and got in touch with GRI when they were expanding worldwide. So that gave me the chance to actually get into the world of video games, specifically mobile games. Working a few months out in Tokyo and then in the London office as the Director of Strategy for Europe. And probably some of my colleagues from that time at GRI who are here would agree that there was a bit of an unhealthy obsession at GRI with KPIs and analytics. Which was actually a very good training for getting into the industry. After that, I set up a small studio. I co-founded Mintsprint. I met a guy who had already started working on a technological solution to do MMOs, specifically massive multiplayer arcade games in iOS. And it sounded a bit like a crazy idea, but very exciting at the same time. So we decided to partner, and we launched Age of Aces at the end of 2013. And that's the game for which we actually built our own internal analytics tool. And then, for a number of reasons, we moved on. Now I'm running this other studio. And we are working on an even crazier project, so happy to talk about that later during the drinks. But talking about Age of Aces, the reasons why we decided to do our own internal solution for analytics were it was really driven by the game and especially the technology that we chose for the game. So we wanted to do something which at the time, no, like Unity or Coco or any of the kind of available engines for games in mobile, just they didn't provide the capabilities to do this. We wanted to do real-time massive multiplayer arcade game, which, like the solution we came up with, was actually having all the logic running on the server, and basically the game was basically sent in streaming to the devices, which meant that all the existing analytic solutions which run in the client didn't really help us much in terms of logging the events that we needed to analyze. Linked to that, another important criteria in choosing to do it this way is that the game mechanics themselves, from a design perspective, were actually very innovative. We didn't really have a reference game, so we expected to have a number of iterations after launch until we got the right model. And we wanted to have like really deep control over the data, being able to dig really deep in our analysis and boil the data in 100 different ways to understand exactly how players were playing and how to go about iterating on the game mechanics and finish those, like the game design. So maybe there was some tool that we didn't know about, but we felt that we had no other chance than to actually build our own analytic solution. And after some testing, we felt that it was actually doable. The way we went about it, this is just a very kind of high-level overview, but essentially we built the tool on the web. It was all the data was being logged on the SQL database, so we were just pulling that with PHP scripts and using some free JavaScript libraries to visualize everything. Let me tell you, once you start looking into those libraries, you go through this moment of thinking, wow, this is actually not going to be that difficult. Yeah, there was this moment, briefly. We actually built the first version of the tool in less than 2 weeks, and it looked good enough. Then you have to start factoring in the extra time of actually debugging and maintaining and adding stuff, and quite a few things that don't really visualize until you go through it. But it's doable. I mean, if anybody, we did it, and it worked. And there were 3 main parts to it. One, which is kind of the standard dashboards with the KPIs that we defined that we needed. Another part, which turned out to be much more useful than we were expecting, which was having a view on real time on who was at that time playing, on which server and in which level they were playing, and let's say exactly what they were doing in the game. That I don't know if that can really be considered analytics, because that's really a player-by-player thing. So it's not about doing analysis. It's more about being like the big brother, so you can know exactly what the player is doing. Coupled with the fact that it's an online multiplayer game, so if you want to know even more than this is telling you, you can actually go into the game, go to the same level where that player is, and you can see what he's doing. I mean, it's as if it was an MMO and you just go next to the guy. So in terms of getting insights for the game mechanics, this was extremely useful. And then another part that we added that was also quite important was a number of reports, like for example a marketing report for every time we run an advertising campaign, where we just put like the dates where that campaign had been running and the countries, and it would populate the data on how many installs we had had, how much money they had spent, for how long they had played. So let's say all the campaign results quite easily populated. Any question on this before I go into sort of the learnings? So essentially, I mean, overall, it was quite a bit of work, but we did learn some very interesting things, and I'd like to share some of them with you so that you don't have to go through the painful exercise yourselves. First one, and this is something I would definitely do again, even if I'm not building the tool myself. But by having to build it, it forced us to really think carefully about what exactly we wanted to measure, and why, and what we were going to do with it. Because when adding a KPI is not just like a 1-minute drag and drop, as in most like third-party tools, but you actually have to go and program it. Well, you think twice before adding extra KPIs or extra dashboards. And my experience with working with big companies is that normally having more information that you need doesn't necessarily help. It can actually detract from the overall value of a dashboard. It can often lead you into useless discussions about things that don't really matter and take time away from looking at the KPIs that do matter. So I think doing that exercise of thinking carefully what exactly do you really want to measure, as opposed to just taking the tool and saying, well, it's giving me all these reports, all these things, so let's look at all of it because it's easy. I think that's something that, well, was really helpful in this case. Second, and again, talking from experience from my time at GRIE, where I mean, a big part of my job was about dealing with KPIs and reporting how the games were doing, both to management, but also helping like the game teams understand how the games were working and how the game mechanics or the different decisions they took might influence the game. Just knowing what a KPI means, and I'm not referring just to whether like the retention rate is measured in one way or another, but going beyond that, like one of the biggest issues we had, for example, at the beginning with our analytics system, was just defining what exactly is a player. hadn't really thought much about that until we found out we had a small bug that was creating some duplicated accounts, which didn't really matter. I mean, those accounts were just empty accounts. It was an issue with basically players registering without and with Game Center. And then the Game Center account is the one where there was activity, and the non-Game Center account simply stayed there. And it counted as an additional player. And it made all our KPIs look strange compared to other games. Like I had references from the industry, from other games, about what our retention rate should be, what our ARPU and lifetime value should be. And then having extra players, which are not real players, it's just like bad, really, was skewed those metrics. But the thing is, it really got us thinking about what exactly are you trying to do with those metrics? Because if the main objective, as was in our case, is to be able to compare your KPIs with those of other games, you need to be sure that you're measuring things in the same way. So whether you count as a player someone who has just installed the game, or who has actually opened it at least once, or has stayed at least those first 15, 20 seconds until your system somehow registers it, well, it can make a significant difference. Third point is what I mentioned before, observing the real-time behavior, which is something I don't know if any analytics solution offers. Again, it's not really analytics, but that turned out to be really insightful. It was almost like having free player testing sessions anytime we wanted. And we found out things, like for example, on one occasion, we were just checking that the servers were running and everything. It was like the maintenance console was linked to the analytics. And I saw that one of our most experienced players was playing in the very first, like in the tutorial levels, again and again and again and again. And I saw it and it's like, well, maybe it's a bug or something. And then I saw it half an hour later, he was still there. And it's like, well, either it's like a serious bug or this guy actually is playing in the tutorial levels. What is going on? And then I went in to see what was going on, and I saw him, what he was doing. He was actually there, he was playing. And I understood, we had this event that we had set up. It was a leaderboard where they were supposed to kill as many enemy planes as possible. And this guy had figured out that the most time-efficient way for him to kill the most planes was actually in the tutorial levels. Which was definitely not the desired behavior, right? It's not what we wanted them to be doing, especially because he was basically in those tutorial levels at the same time as new players were coming into the game and playing those tutorial levels, and they were meeting each other, and that was not intended to happen. So that informed how we set up the next events going forward. And that's something we would have never figured out just by looking like the normal analysis. That would have come up as something strange, but even if we identified it, which would have been rare, I don't think we would have ever understood what was going on without having this sort of capability. One advantage, obviously, of building our own solution is that it was completely customized to our needs from the start, and also that we didn't need any third-party SDKs, which can sometimes be problematic in terms of maintenance or when Apple one day decides that they want to change the rules of the game or whatever. Now, there were some drawbacks as well. Number one in the list and most important, the resources required. Again, it's doable with limited resources, but we were, by the time we stopped working on this game, we were already starting to hit the ceiling in terms of performance and scalability. So I think the simple solution that I mentioned before that we use of just using kind of MySQL queries on the SQL database, I mean, we created a data warehouse for it, but I think getting that right requires someone who really knows what he's doing, which wasn't the case with us. So I think it's tricky. You have to really know what you're doing in terms, like technically speaking. We never really managed to integrate the attribution data, which was a big issue for us because we wanted to grow via marketing. So making sure, like, we could never trace the installs, like which player in our game came from a Facebook advertising campaign or from a Tallos advertising campaign. didn't find a way to do that. And also in the end, I mean, even though we did get a lot of features that we really cared about, there were some other features that we would have liked to use that we never got around to doing, like segmentation or A/B testing, which most third-party analytic solutions nowadays just offer out of the box. So it's what you really give up on some really useful features. Well, based on all that, I guess my recommendation, or what we are going to do going forward, is I wouldn't do this again unless I absolutely need to. Like in this case, I think we had no choice, but if I had had a choice, I think I should have taken it, like some third-party solution. However, I think doing at least a mental exercise before you just like jump on this third-party solution, whichever it is, and say, okay, it has all these cool features, let's start using it, let's take the dashboard, let's start adding events and stuff. Doing the mental exercise of deciding what you really think you need to measure and why, without being conditioned by what the tool is offering you, I think that is really helpful, and I'll definitely try to keep doing it. And well, finally, if if you have at some point the chance somehow to create this sort of real-time, player-by-player monitoring tool, which obviously if you have thousands of players, you cannot be monitoring all of them at once. But even if it's just a random selection, every now and then having the designer look at what's going on, and then you see some very unexpected things going on sometimes that can actually give you very valuable insights. So that's something that, if that tool actually exists, I suggest you check it out. That is it. Any questions?
Do you use any particular mathematical model or data science technique to identify, okay, to discriminate between a player and a non-real player?
Sort of, yeah. It wasn't a very sophisticated thing, but we did. And when we found out this bug that I mentioned, we couldn't really fix it completely. And we improved to some extent. Just like technically, there was sort of bug there, but we could never really fully fix it. We still had duplicate accounts. We did some analysis to figure out like what the frequency was of these duplicate accounts, and we basically did a relatively rough correction to the numbers. Wasn't terribly accurate, but it made, I think, our KPIs much more comparable to what other games do. But it wasn't very sophisticated. I mean, I'm not a data scientist. One thing I learned at McKinsey, and then I think this is actually is a good learning, was that it's as important to be able to communicate the result of the analysis as the accuracy of the analysis itself. So if you do a super cool analysis that is amazing, but there's no way to actually explain it, and they just have to believe in what you say, because this is like you're like a black box coming up with this fantastic analysis, and you tell them this is the solution, and you cannot explain a bit the process, then they don't care, they don't act on it, and then it doesn't matter how good the analysis was. So yeah, we followed very much this kind of keep it simple approach to our analysis in general.
You said it was hard to track marketing attribution.
Yes.
Talk a little bit more about that. Why was it? Did you not track URLs and click-throughs, or why was that so difficult?
So what we wanted to do, I mean, we could have used the attribution measuring tools, third-party SDKs. What we looked into those. What we couldn't easily do was kind of migrate the data from those tools to our own internal database, so that we could cross that data with the rest of the in-game behavior, so that we could easily see, okay, like the players coming from Facebook are spending more than the players coming from Tallos. It wasn't it wasn't very straightforward. I guess there must have been a way.
You sort of couldn't go end to end almost.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Which is what we were trying to do. Instead of that, what we did is basically segment, like try to make sure that the different campaigns didn't take place in the same country at the same time. So essentially, if in the UK we were running a Facebook campaign, we would not be running a Chargus campaign. We would do like Facebook for a month, and then do a different one for another month, and then, well...
So you could distinguish between
yes.
relatively easily. Yeah.
Yeah, so we would do that. It's very relatively rough approach, and it doesn't work obviously if you are using many marketing channels as well at the same time. But that was our approach.
Yeah, I was one of the big console companies, and they have a similar issue. It's very difficult to go end to end from someone coming from somewhere to what they're doing there.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, we did find, by using this relatively rough approach that I mentioned, we found very significant differences in the in-game behavior of players coming from one ad network versus another, which I think had to do a lot with, for example, the age of the demographics of the players that we were getting. Like, for example, Facebook allowed us to do demographic segmentation or demographic targeting, but most other networks don't. The ad networks don't allow that. But well, we couldn't really ever say for sure that was the case.
I thought it was kind of cute that people like to see the behavioral trace live. It's kind of more exciting than looking at a log file, because in a way it's kind of the same stuff. But do you think it's just the real-time nature of it? You have to watch the lags, or what is it that makes it more interesting for the designers? Because if I go to a designer and I say, "Why don't you look at this log trace?"
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not going to be a happy ending to that.
Yeah, and obviously, on the one hand, it's much more entertaining to watch it real live. But I think actually it gives you an insight that it can give you insights that you wouldn't get from the logs, because in the log you are only recording certain events, and you cannot record everything that happens. I mean, potentially could, but then it would be unreadable anyway. So with the real-time monitoring, you're not recording most of the stuff that happens.
Oh, I see. So the real-time monitoring is got lots more detail in it. Is that?
Well, I mean, in our case, it didn't have as much detail. It was basically the player, the data on the player, and in which level they were playing, which plane they were using. Just relatively simple. Basically, where were they in the game?
Okay.
Which sounds relatively straightforward. You wouldn't expect to get that much insight from that, but actually we did,
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting. We found behaviors that would have been really difficult to get from logs. For example, we found that there were players. This was a game where it was a bit like an MMORPG sort of thing, where there were levels where you would only play with your allies. So if other players came into your same battle, they would be allies. If there were players playing with other armies, they would just go to different instances. But there were also levels where if other people came in and they were with a different army, well, you would be fighting them. It would be player versus player. And there was no way around that. If you were in that battle, it was a PvP zone. If anyone came in a different army, you would play against them. We found that there were players that were actively going to those levels and avoiding PvP play. So they would be playing there, all happy, trying to finish the level, and if suddenly another player came in on a different side, they would leave the level and go somewhere else, which was very odd. We later understood, or we think we understood why most of them were doing it. It's you actually could get a medal, an achievement, for finishing that level. But they didn't, so they wanted the achievement, but they didn't want to play PvP. So they were trying to find the time where there were no players there so that they could go in and get the achievement. So that's something that it's very, if you don't have a way to predict that kind of behavior, then most likely you're not going to be logging the events that would tell you that that is happening.
It's interesting because it's kind of a halfway house between, you're just recording discrete events that feed into your KPIs, but you're sitting there breathing down someone's neck watching them play. And this is kind of like a way of getting the best of both worlds.
It's closer to play testing in a way, I think, but very useful. Yes.
Speaking of tracking mistakes, brother, have you seen what do you do with vegan behavior? Like if people cheating in the game or pirating?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. How did you deal with this? Because these characters in this game.
Yeah, that's so. We certainly had our good share of that. Basically, what we did was we identified those like the cheaters, and then tried to keep an eye on them to see whether they were annoying to other players or not. Basically, we took a decision not to act unless we felt that they were damaging, let's say, to the other players who were not cheaters. And luckily, we didn't see like any significant instance of players like leaving the game or something because they have been playing with the cheaters. So we just kept an eye on it. I'm not exactly sure what we would have done. Like we had already prepared a button which basically reset their accounts, so that we wouldn't kick them out of the game, but it would be a pretty annoying yellow card because they would have to start from the beginning again. So that was ready, but we never got around to actually use it.